Hello again, everyone, and welcome to our next Civil War lecture. We're going to be talking about the Missouri Compromise and the Nullification Crisis. I mean, we came pretty close again to a problem in the United States over slavery, and we talked about slavery's effect. It wasn't just abolitionists; slavery affected other things. Representation in Congress, northern and southern interests, new territory, and whether it was going to be free or not. Because if new territories became states, obviously states send representatives in Congress, and of course the South and the North wanted to maintain a balance because they feared if one side or the other got too many people in Congress that they would be able to leverage more power in the country in their favor when they make laws and all that. But we already saw the Louisiana Purchase brought in lots of territory. Most of this is the largest acquisition of territory that we've ever had. And of course, we know we've always been trying to maintain a balance of slave and free states, even since the passage and the ratification of the Constitution. We kind of kicked the can down the road, and we talked about in one of our earlier lectures that a lot of the people who opposed slavery, even at that Constitutional Convention, thought that, well, slavery will eventually fizzle out, and it looked like it was going to, but then we talked about how technology, as far as the cotton gin, gave the southern states a way to produce more cotton, and we know the European markets were demanding it heavily, so it obviously reignited slavery in the South. But anyway, in 1818 and 1819, we had an issue. Alabama had just come into the Union as a slave state, and we had a balance. But the territory of Missouri in 1819 applied for statehood. The problem is that would obviously throw off the balance of free slaves and slave states. So in Congress already, they were already quarreling over Missouri. No, it can't happen. It's going to come in as a free state. No, it's got to come in as a slave state. Blah, blah, whatever. It looks like we're kind of going to come to blows over this in Congress again. Initially, James Talmadge of New York proposed an amendment that would kind of gradually eliminate slavery. He didn't want to see slavery expand in the new territories, and he wanted Missouri to eventually become a free state. He stipulated that a part of the Missouri statehood bill should be that all children born within the state after the admission should be free at the age of 25 years old. So that would kind of generationally end slavery. Now it passed the House, but the Senate obviously rejected that. But eventually, we would decide the fate of Missouri through what was called the Missouri Compromise in 1820. Missouri would be admitted as a free state, a slave state. Now, the part of the compromise was at the southern boundary of Missouri, the 3630 latitude line, that anything above that southern boundary of Missouri in the future, in new territory, would be free states. Now, that kind of appeased the people who didn't want to see slavery expand, and northerner manufacturers and all that. So the Missouri Compromise kind of stopped the crisis, but you could already see a problem here. I mean, we know we're going to expand again in the future, and we're going to continue trying to patch up a greater problem over the issue of slavery. So Missouri Compromise, no new territories that come into the new nation above that 3630 southern boundary of Missouri will be slave states. That will have to be free states, except for Missouri. Missouri will be the only one that will be allowed. But it did avert the problem in the short run. And another part of the Missouri Compromise was to balance the slave and free states that Maine came into the Union. And that's really what stalled the problem. So Missouri Compromise kind of temporarily stops the issue. Now we also know that there was a sectional conflict between the northern manufacturers and southern cotton plantation owners over tariffs. We know northern industry wanted to see higher tariffs because they thought there was a threat of importing foreign goods that would hurt their industry's ability to sell their products. So the problem with that is, in Southern eyes and their cotton exports, typically when a country passes protectionist tariffs, another country will respond by doing the same, and it slows down global trade. The South needed low tariffs. That way other countries would have low tariffs, so their southern cotton could be exported globally without all the problems with tariffs. So there was an issue. In 1828, Congress, that was dominated by the North, enacted what was called the Tariff of Abominations. They raised tariffs, and this just set Southerners off, especially John C. Calhoun, who published what he called the South Carolina Exposition and Protest, which said that states had the right to not abide by any unconstitutional act of the federal government, and they can declare that it's null and void. Well, the problem with John C. Calhoun's thinking is he tried to sound all crusader, and he was a good guy looking out for the states, but he was acting in self-interest. John C. Calhoun was a slave owner. He believed in slavery. He talked about the act of nullification. His nullification doctrine kind of branched off of an earlier doctrine set forth by James Madison and Thomas Jefferson in 1798 and 1799 in their Virginia and Kentucky resolutions. Now, James Madison and Thomas Jefferson talked about not adhering to government acts that are unconstitutional, but they were actually talking about the Alien Sedition Acts passed by John Adams, which was absolutely unconstitutional. And James Madison and Thomas Jefferson were right. We should not abide by government acts that are outside the law. Problem with John C. Calhoun declaring nullification and the state's supremacy over the federal government is the federal government has the right to levy taxes. Tariffs are a tax. I mean, that's explicitly listed in the Constitution as something that our Congress can do. So this obviously became a major problem, and so Southerners looked to Andrew Jackson, who was elected on tariff reform. And once he was in office, he even, he talked about narrowing the tariff somewhat. But anyway, the South Carolinians got together and they passed what was called the Ordinance of Nullification, which forbade the collection of the tariffs from the 1828 Tariff Act within their state borders. And they felt empowered to do this because, well, Andrew Jackson is the president now. He's a Southerner. He owns slaves. Of course he'll be on our side. He wants lower tariffs. But Andrew Jackson did the opposite. Andrew Jackson saw John C. Calhoun as a tyrant. He saw him as a self-righteous, self-interest crusader. He knew what he was doing was destructive. And although those things were true about Jackson, he was a slave owner. He was from the South. He was also a Unionist. Above anything else, Andrew Jackson was pro-Union more than he was pro-slavery or pro-Southern. So what he did instead is he passed what became known as the Force Act, and that he would, by force, collect the duties of the tariff, and if he had to, he would call out the troops to go into South Carolina or any other state that deliberately forbade the federal government from collecting this tariff revenue. Now, again, our Congress has the right to enact tariffs and taxes. So John C. Calhoun was way wrong in this. So this conflict almost culminated into a fight. But eventually it was resolved through the Tariff of 1833 when Congress enacted a more moderate tariff. They lowered the tariffs just a little bit and it kind of fizzled out. But this is important because you're starting to see not only a great divide again in the North and South over issues that pertain to slavery. In this case, it was economic tariffs. But now people are talking about nullification and even suggesting going against and deliberately defying federal government congressional actions, even ones that are constitutional. And even some people are even whispering about secession. So that's the significance here. But really, again, it's about slavery. The people in the South need those low tariffs because they have to export their cotton to all these European nations, and we want trade, and lower tariffs are good, but let's don't kid ourselves. The South just needed those foreign markets because there wasn't enough demand in the United States because they had so many people in bondage. Maybe if the millions of slaves were laborers, then they would have more people to sell to. Having a captive workforce is only so good for so long because you're enslaving people who cannot buy your stuff. The northern economy was more diverse, and even the southern non-slave owners, a lot of them defended slavery, even though it actually worked against them because their economy was limited. It was dominated by slave owners. And if they had a more diverse economy, they would have more opportunities. But nonetheless, Missouri Compromise and Nullification Crisis, it reflected a growing problem. The epicenter of it was slavery. It reflected a divide in this country. And in our next section, we're going to talk about the Mexican-American War and how even more territory brought into the United States created a problem so great that the kicking the can down the road and of trying to avoid the issue of slavery by patchwork actions by Congress was not going to happen anymore. This country was headed for war.